Consider H.J.Res 37, the Yemen War Powers Resolution. For over 4 years, there's been a conflict going on in Yemen led by the Saudi government with assistance from the United States. But Congress never actually declared our involvement in this war. We ceded our responsibility first to President Obama and now to President Trump. I don't care who's in the White House, Democrat or Republican, doing that is a dereliction of our Article I authority. Bombs fall daily. They fall on weddings, hospitals, and homes, even on school buses. And nearly all the bombs say the same thing, made in the United States of America. All during a war Congress never authorized. More than 22 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, and 85,000 children under the age of 5 have already died of hunger and disease. We need to reclaim our role over U.S. foreign policy. Prior Congresses used every legislative trick in the book to prevent this debate. War powers resolutions relating to Yemen were even deprivileged, not once, but twice. In December, the Senate passed this bipartisan resolution to end U.S. support related to this conflict. It is past time that this institution did the same. Congress should not be complicit in the greatest humanitarian crisis happening in the world today, and this majority will not shirk its responsibilities. Before we hear from our witnesses, let me turn to the ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments that he wants to make.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing today and to our witnesses for both making the effort to be here. Subject matter of today's hearing concerns one of the greatest powers Congress possesses, the power to say when, where, and with whom the United States will go to war. Under Article I of the Constitution, Congress possesses the power to declare war. This power is sometimes in tension with the President's Article II power as the Commander-in-Chief. I've said previously that I would like to have a debate on our current needs for an authorization for the use of military force. Our military is engaged in conflicts across the Middle East and much of the world and is currently operating under 2 AUMFs, one for the war on terror and one for Iraq. Given that these were passed in 2001 and 2002, before most of us were even in Congress, it's long since time that Congress should undertake this debate, particularly given the realities of the current conflict in Syria. However, I do not believe today's bill rises to that level. We need a discussion and a debate in Congress on where and how the American military will be committed to long-term, open-ended conflicts like the one in Syria. This bill does not accomplish that, in my opinion. Instead, directing the President to withdraw American troops from hostilities they are not presently participating in. For that reason, I'll find myself in the unusual position of actually opposing this because we've worked on this in the past. But there's we have been close. There's a big difference, in my view, between committing combat troops and actually being engaged in complex supporting allies. And we'll have a chance to talk about this. I look forward to both the testimony and then what I'm sure will be a robust discussion. But just to be crystal clear, there's a big difference between, let's say, although the War Powers Act didn't exist there, something like the Yom Kippur War, where we literally provided the wherewithal in October of 1973 for Israel to survive. That was not, we were not in the war, but we were certainly supporting a friend and ally at a time of great tension. So again, it'll be interesting to me to hear what all our colleagues have to say on this, but the President does have legitimate powers in this area, short of going to war and committing American troops to combat. So I look forward to the discussion, both here and on the floor later.
No, and I appreciate that. And I just want to say for the record that Mr. Cole, over the years, he and I have agreed on the need for Congress to reassert its authority when it comes to wars halfway around the world. For too long, under both Democrats and Republicans, we've been content to sit back. I know it's difficult when we get into the discussions about authorizations because those are difficult conversations to have, and trying to get a majority to get behind something is very, very difficult, but we need to do that. And on this, I think the whole world is horrified by what's happening in Yemen, and I think for us to do nothing would make us complicit, and I think we have to. I think this resolution is timely, and so Mr. Engel and Mr. McCall, we are delighted that you were here. Anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. And I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Cole. Okay. I'm glad that the Rules Committee is moving this resolution forward because it's long past time that Congress take up the debate about how and where our military is engaged around the world. The measure you're considering today is a step in the right direction toward Congress reasserting its foreign policy prerogatives. For the last few years, we've all seen horrific images of the civilian casualties in the Yemen war. Starving children, millions displaced, outbreaks of deadly disease, and last week the Foreign Affairs Committee held a hearing on our policy in the Arabian Peninsula. We heard experts testify about the humanitarian crisis created by the conflict in Yemen. 85,000 children have died of malnutrition. 14 million Yemenites are on the brink of famine, and more than 1 million suffer from cholera. We cannot overstate just how dire this situation is, and that's why our policy should be to push the parties to the conflict toward a political solution. This measure, introduced by Mr. Khanna, will help us do that. Let me explain why this is so important and why I support moving this resolution right now. In last year's defense authorization, Congress required the administration to certify that the Saudis and Emiratis were taking real steps to reduce the risk of harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure resulting from their military operations in Yemen. In the period of time before the certification was due, attacks against civilians rose sharply. The International Red Cross reported that August was the most violent month that year, with nearly 500 people killed in just 9 days. In the last few years, the coalition has carried out 18,000 airstrikes. A full one-third of those strikes hit non-military targets. One of those hits was a school bus of 40 children, all killed. And it's happened again and again. The coalition's operations have been characterized by strike after strike after strike with unnecessary civilian casualties. It's simply not acceptable. It's also not acceptable that the administration certified that the Saudis and Emiratis were taking, quote, demonstrable actions, unquote, to reduce civilian deaths. This certification flies in the face of everything we've seen, all the reporting, and all the facts on the ground. It was an utter rebuke of the truth. So I want to be clear. We do have critical strategic interests in that region. The Houthis in Yemen receive support from Iran. The Houthis are launching missiles into Saudi Arabia, threatening Saudi civilians as well as American personnel. But I cannot support providing assistance that we know is being used to kill innocent people. And if the administration won't demand any sort of accountability from the Saudis and Emiratis, it's up to Congress to act. The Pentagon has stopped refueling as a matter of policy, but policies can be reversed. So this resolution would cut off refueling as a matter of law. It sends a clear message to the administration, our partners in the Gulf, and our adversaries. Congress is not going to sit back and shirk its Article I responsibilities when it comes to foreign policy. Now, the executive branch has limited its definition of hostilities to situations in which units of American armed forces are actively engaged in exchanges of fire with opposing forces. No surprise there. Of course, the executive branch would prefer a definition that affords greater unilateral power to the president. In fact, year after year, the executive branch has worked to chip away, bit by bit, at Congress's war powers. But Article I of the Constitution is clear. War powers are the responsibility of the legislative branch. We need to assert our role with respect to Yemen. Congress isn't subservient to the presidency, and we shouldn't accept the executive branch's exceedingly narrow interpretation of our authority. I join this resolution as an original co-sponsor because I am confident it's an important step in reevaluating our country's role in the conflict in Yemen and in reclaiming Congress's prerogatives on these matters. I know the chairman has worked on that for years. This same resolution text passed the Senate with bipartisan support. The Foreign Affairs Committee reported this measure favorably out of our committee last week. I strongly support advancing this resolution to consideration by the full House. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. McCall, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Cole, I want to thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here with my good friend, Elliot Engel. Let me begin by saying that I completely support Congress's solemn duty under Article I of the Constitution to authorize the commitment of U.S. troops to foreign hostilities. But that is not what we're talking about in this case. I believe this is more of a political move rather than a serious bill to address the conflict and the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. I do not believe it should be brought to the floor because it's a misuse of the war powers tool that will set a dangerous precedent. This Resolution 37 misuses a privileged war powers mechanism for withdrawing U.S. troops from foreign combat to try to get at the different issue of security assistance to third countries. It provides no clear decisions on which forms of assistance to Gulf states are cut off. It gives no guidance on mitigating the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. Alarmingly, it completely ignores the destabilizing role that Iran is playing in Yemen and that region. This is irresponsible. It's trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole, in my judgment. It's also problematic that this is being rushed through before members, especially our 42 brand new members on foreign affairs, have had even the opportunity to be fully briefed on the situation in Yemen and the actual nature and purpose of U.S. engagement on the Arabian Peninsula. The privileged statutory mechanism to force withdrawal of U.S. forces under the War Powers Resolution applies only when U.S. troops are engaged in unauthorized live-fire hostilities. As the Department of Defense has repeatedly confirmed as recently as last week, U.S. armed forces are not engaged in hostilities against Houthi forces in Yemen. Even the aerial refueling of coalition jets, which does not constitute hostilities as traditionally understood, ended last November. This resolution stretches the definition of hostilities to cover non-U.S. military operations by other countries. It reinterprets U.S. support to those countries as engagement in hostilities, and it would have implications far beyond Saudi Arabia. In fact, it would apply to 117 different countries around the world, including the state of Israel. This approach will allow any single member to use a privilege mechanism to second guess, as I said, the U.S. security cooperation relationships with more than 100 countries throughout the world. And under this model, if someone doesn't like something that any of our security partners does, that member can force the consideration of a resolution directing the removal of U.S. forces from hostilities in or affecting that situation. It no longer matters that U.S. forces are not actually conducting those hostilities. So this interpretation could impact our assistance to Israel. It could affect our cooperation with our NATO allies. It could impact our counterterrorism cooperation with African nations in the Sahel. We could recklessly undo critical security relationships we have spent decades building. This is not what I believe the War Powers Resolution ever intended, and it should not be misused this way now. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a detailed letter sent to Congress last year by the Department of Defense's acting general counsel. It's a list of security cooperation agreements the United States is currently engaged in from the Department of Defense. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No one is saying that U.S. security assistance to Saudi Arabia or anyone else is beyond congressional scrutiny. Congress has many tools at its disposal, including congressional arms sales notifications that Mr. Engel and I sign off on. We can have targeted legislation and in the annual appropriations process, among others. But this resolution is vague and irresponsible. It will create new doubts for our partners and allies around the world. And for those reasons, I strongly oppose this measure and would be against bringing it to the floor for a vote. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. McCall. I appreciate it. Look, I understand why some might not agree with the bill, but this is a bill that was introduced, I think, in January. It went through a hearing. It had a markup. This is not. We've called for amendments. We're going to decide on some amendments. So you may not agree with the bill, but the process is perfectly fine. This is the way the process is supposed to work. We're not end running around anything, and this matter certainly hasn't been rushed. I mean, we've been trying to have this debate in the House all last year as well, and had been denied that opportunity. So, I appreciate the fact that you disagree with the bill, but not the process. This is not being brought, this is not a special privilege resolution being brought to the floor. It's coming through the Rules Committee, where we're having a hearing here, and there'll be a markup. So I just wanted to state that for the record. Ms. Torres. Oh. Yeah, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you both for being before our committee today to bring up such an important legislation, H.J.Res 37. Very important issue, and I'm glad that we're able to have a discussion on this issue today. What is happening right now in Yemen is unspeakable. And I'm going to cite a few statistics. More than 10,000 people killed, 2 million displaced, 1.8 children with acute malnutrition. And those numbers don't begin to identify the traumatic suffering that nearly 16 million people have gone through. This is a crisis that deserves our attention. But more than that, we need to take responsibility for our part in it. The conflict in Yemen is complex. The United States is not solely responsible for this conflict. Our Saudi Arabia partners aren't either. But Saudi Arabia's involvement in the conflict means that Saudi Arabia has a responsibility. And U.S. military support for the Saudi-led coalition means that we do too. We have strategic interests in the Middle East. One of those interests, as we all know, is countering Iranian aggression. Saudi Arabia is an important partner in that effort, but that doesn't mean that we abandon our principles. It does not mean that we turn a blind eye on the way that the Saudi-led coalition is waging this war. We have seen unacceptable civilian casualties. Badly needed humanitarian supplies have been blocked. And there comes a time when enough is enough. So I'm glad that we are considering this resolution today, because we can't continue to look the other way at the case of Saudi Arabia and Yemen in isolation. There has been a pattern of behavior in this administration, whether it is cozying up to Vladimir Putin or ignoring human rights violations in North Korea and China, or selling our democracy in Honduras, and allowing a corrupt government in Guatemala to destroy the rule of law to escape prosecution. Time and time again, we have seen this administration turn their back on democracy and human rights, time and time again. Look the other way when it is convenient. And when we do that, we don't just betray our American values, we also undermine our long-term strategic plans. Because when governments steal from their people, when they repress their people, we see the rise of extremism, criminality, and instability. We're seeing that crisis in our southern border caused by the root causes of rampant government corruption in the Northern Triangle. And that impacts our national security that we are doing today in part of getting back to a foreign policy that is smart and principled. That's what this resolution does. We're getting back to those principles. And I thank my colleagues for bringing this forward in this legislation.
Thank you.
And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Woodall, and let me just say for the record, since this is your first hearing since you made your announcement that you're not going to be running again, that this will be the first of many times we're going to say we're going to miss you.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Which means I've got 23 months. I told someone, good news, I've got 23 months to be unhinged. They said, Rob, I think
maybe
I think you mean unleashed.
Yeah, maybe after 23 months we'll miss you less.
I appreciate that. When you are in your last 23 months, you start thinking about those things that you wished you'd done earlier. And I thought about what Chairman Engel said about the gradual erosion of Article I powers by the executive branch. And And yes, I've seen that in the Obama administration. I've seen that in the Trump administration. And I wholeheartedly, we've talked about that many times in the Rules Committee, I wholeheartedly want to be your partner in doing that. But I see the ranking member sitting beside you, and I know he wholeheartedly wants to be a partner in doing that too. But I have not ever heard the ranking member be more unequivocal in his opposition to a bill than I've heard him be about this one. And I share that with you because I look forward to, I tell folks back home, in fact, I told a school group this morning, one of the best ways to build relationships on Capitol Hill are congressional delegation trips abroad, because we're not standing in front of a foreign government as Republicans and Democrats, we're standing in front of a foreign government as Americans, and we speak with one voice on behalf of a nation that the world counts on to play a leadership role. I agree with most of what my friend Ms. Torres had to say about human suffering and the importance of what goes on, and I know the ranking member does too. So I want to tell you that my comments are going to be colored with the disappointment that when I see the two of you come before the Rules Committee, I expect that same one-voice treatment that we get when the two of you travel around the globe together, that we are a single nation speaking with a single voice on behalf of oppressed peoples around the globe. I'm looking at the report, and I did see that there was a hearing, though the hearing in the report is titled U.S. Policy in the Arabian Peninsula. I'm thinking we've got lots of problems in the Arabian Peninsula, not just Yemen. Have, particularly all the new members, have folks had a chance to get the classified briefing on Yemen that we all got last December? Have folks had a chance to focus in on this as Ms. Torres went through point by point? I think it was not multifaceted, but it was an incredibly complex situation, I believe was her term, and I know she's exactly right.
Well, and Mr. Worrell, thank you for that question. As I said in my statement, the answer is no. We have 14 new members that have never received a classified briefing on the situation on the ground. It's very complex. I think everything Ms. Torres was saying, I was in agreement with. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's a foreign policy challenge like we've never seen. The Iranians are in Yemen supporting the Houthis against the Saudis with ballistic missiles, firing rockets into Saudi, and then you got Israel. So my point is that we're misconstruing this war powers resolution to a place where it was never intended, and that is to places where we just provide security cooperation assistance rather than active engagement of hostility. And quite frankly, there's nothing to withdraw from Yemen in terms of U.S. forces because we don't have any forces there. The only forces we have in Yemen are the counterterrorism ones against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that was authorized under the 2001 AUMF that Congress passed.
Yet a different topic altogether, but I hope we will get around to having an AUMF conversation here, as 2001, again, things that I've been complicit in far too long to put that conversation off. Mr. Chairman, let me ask you, I'm not a war powers scholar, but I tend to agree with Mr. McCall. As I go back and read some of the debate from that era, I don't see it intended for the purpose that we have today, though it's certainly not unusual for us to take new authorities out for new spins from time to time to see if we can't make a difference. Is it your understanding that this is exactly what the War Powers resolution was intended to do, or are we taking it out for a walk in a new direction today?
Talking to me or the chairman?
I was talking to my Foreign Affairs chairman.
Oh, okay. Look, Mr. Woodall, you said it right in my opinion when you said under both Democratic and Republican administrations, year after year after year after year, decade after decade, Congress has basically relegated itself to not doing what it should be doing under Article 1 of the Constitution. And if this does nothing more than rekindles a realization that we really can't go on like this, then we'll have done a good thing. The fact of the matter is, and I've been saying this ad nauseum, we are a separate branch of government, and the ability to go to war rests with us. And before any of us were born, in World War II, December 7th, 1941, we have not declared war at all, even though we've been involved in numerous wars, we've been involved in numerous hostilities. So I think that whether you agree with it in this particular instance, and we obviously do, and you obviously don't, we should be united in making sure that Congress, no matter what party controls Congress, has an ability to not give a blank check to the executive, no matter what party the president comes from. And I think this is something that we're finally doing. And I've been around here long enough to know that when people don't want us to proceed with something, the argument is always made that it's being precipitous and people have not yet been exposed. Everyone in the Congress has been exposed. Everyone in the Congress knows. You go right down to the Vietnam War, to the vote in the Iraqi War, and keep going. We have just basically said to the president, go ahead, go ahead. And so I really think that we would be doing our country a service if you don't like this, okay, but certainly before this term is up, we should be able to redefine clearly what the Constitution tells us that we can do. And I think this is a great first step by the Yemen war, and I said it in my remarks. I'm not, the rebels aren't my cup of tea, and I think the Iranians are making mischief as usual, and I think the Saudis, despite the fact that we have a lot of difficulties with some of the things they do, they are our friends and allies, but it doesn't mean that we give them a blank check. We have an absolute right to say enough, and an absolute right to reassert Article 1, which we are a co-equal branch of government, and I think the eroding power of the Congress really needs to end. We need to reassert our authority. So I appreciate it if you think this is the wrong place to do it, but I think this is exactly the right place to do it.
This may well be the right place to do it. My question is this the right language in which to do it, knowing that we may differ on whether or not this is the right language? And again, I'm not a foreign affairs expert. Can you tell me about some of the other options that were considered and rejected by the committee?
Well, you remember that this is something that the Senate, with a number of Republican crossovers, voted for in the last session. And so we just essentially took that and moved it over here, and that's the reason why we did what we did.
We'll have to have the House asserting its authority against the Senate and that gradual erosion of
we could at
authority
least agree on
over
that.
time, too.
That's something we could agree.
Let me,
Mr. Woodall, can I
please,
yeah,
Mr. McClellan.
last year, Chairman Ed Royce and Elliott worked on a House resolution that was bipartisan that didn't invoke the War Powers Act. Again, if we had troops in Yemen, I would say the War Powers Act would apply. And we should exercise our Article 1 authority under the Constitution. The problem with this whole argument is we don't have active hostilities. We don't have U.S. troops on the ground in Yemen. So, but we had a resolution last year that dealt with the situation, the humanitarian crisis in Syria, calling it out for what it is and calling for peace in the region. That's the sort of thing that we can do, I think, working together.
well, I confess I'm not a foreign affairs expert. I'm a process expert, but I suppose I believe that you all had access to information I didn't have. I know this is not a classified setting here, that there were trigger pullers, that there were bomb droppers, that there were troops doing all of those things that I anticipate the War Powers Resolution coming into play to bring those folks back home. We don't have trigger pullers and bomb droppers. And
The Iranians do.
Mr. Chairman, have we used a War Powers Resolution to deal with non-troop involvement?
Well, let me
before?
say this. The president has suspended refueling, and we don't have troops on the ground to fight Houthi forces. That's true. But the president claims authority to start refueling again at any time, and this resolution would prevent that. And it would also send a clear signal that the United States' involvement in the Yemeni civil war needs to change, which is why I support this resolution. And I think it's important to take a stand.
Well, I
I respectfully hear what you're saying, but I think that, that the arguments of negativity can be used towards anything. We decided this was the right venue, and I hope that there will be people on both sides of the aisle who will understand that we need to reassert ourselves, and we're doing that right here. It is limited. This resolution doesn't affect any refueling or security assistance anywhere else. It's only limited to Yemen, and it only prevents hostilities, including refueling and counter-Houthi operations, and it would not affect anything else.
I tell folks that the best part about being on the Rules Committee is that Chairman and the Ranking Member come up every Monday and give me a private tutoring session on things that I might not understand well. And the second best thing is, while the Chairman and Ranking Member are busy talking to world-class experts on these issues, they also have to hear my 2 cents on those things. And my
No,
process.
I respect your opinion. I think I know you're only trying to do the right thing, but I do hope that from here on in, we can put our heads together and get bipartisan changes in some of the things. You know, we're talking about an AUMF. I know we're not dealing with that here, but when I voted on it, I was here, and I voted for the AUMF. I had no idea. My city, New York City, had just been attacked, and I had no idea that how many years later we would be, 18 years later, we would be using that as a catch-all to give any president the right to do whatever he wants to do. I think it's about time we reclaim some of this, and that's what we're trying to do here. It's not a picture-perfect fitting in all the slots, but I think it sends an important message that Congress is reasserting itself in what could be more important than war, life and death, and we're doing that. So it's not the 100% venue, but pretty good, I think. I think it's pretty good.
I've been looking at some Ruth Bader Ginsburg biographies recently, and folks have talked about the wisdom of finding the right case for her to begin making her push forward for equal rights and equal opportunities. I hear you say this is not 100%, and that this is not within all the four corners. I would implore you. We've gotten off to a rocky start here in the new Congress in terms of collaboration. But I know you've got a good partner in the ranking member. The problems that you identify are real and lasting, and I hope that we will find an opportunity to speak with one voice to make the difference that I know all three of us would like to make.
Let me just say that some of us disagree with the executive branch on the definition of hostilities. Mm-hmm. And as we mentioned before, in both Democratic and Republican administrations, the executive branch hasn't defined mid-air refueling. That was something that we had talked about, I think, at the committee, as hostilities. But the executive branch, the president and all of his advisors, not only this president, but many presidents, take narrow views so it can conduct activities it likes without having to worry about getting specific authorization from Congress. And I just don't think we should accept their definition. And I want to mention again, we're obviously a separate branch of government. Article 1 of the Constitution gives us authority over war powers, and we have a responsibility to assert our definition of hostilities. And I want to mention again, as I mentioned before, the Senate has already passed the text we're considering today. This resolution defines hostilities to include refueling of non-U.S. aircraft for missions in the Yemeni civil war, and this definition is limited, very limited, to that context, and I support it.
Yeah, I thank you both for doing the difficult work that you do, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall, and I think it's really important, that last point that was made by Chairman Engel on the refueling issue, that even though at the pressure of U.S. Congress, the administration did stop that practice, there is currently nothing in statute to prevent them, to prevent any future missions. So with that, Ms. Matsui?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to welcome the Chair and Ranking Member here today. I just have a few comments here because much has been said, but just want to remark that it's been over 2 years ago that the World Health Organization, United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, and the World Food Program said in a joint statement that the conflict in Yemen has become the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. That was 2 years ago. Now, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen just gets worse by the hour. The Yemeni people are suffering from the worst cholera epidemic in history, while tens of thousands of children have died from starvation and disease. The UN believes over 22 million Yemenis need urgent humanitarian assistance to meet basic needs, including food and water, out of a pre-war population of 28 million. The issue has been exacerbated by the destruction of water treatment facilities and other civilian targets by the armed forces of Saudi Arabia. It is irresponsible for Congress to allow the administration to continue to support and perpetuate a war that is causing this humanitarian crisis without debate here in the United States Congress. I don't believe we can just stand around and just see this happen. That's not the way we as Americans really believe we should be. Now, this resolution will not harm negotiations, empower Iran, or hurt our work against al-Qaeda and ISIS. It will simply allow Congress to assert its moral and constitutional duty to conduct congressional oversight into this terrible conflict. I am pleased to support this legislation because Congress needs to send a message that is not the way to perpetuate the war. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions. The first is, first of all, thank you both for being here. The first is for Ranking Member McCall. Representative McCall, do you believe the resolution that's before you today is an accurate description of what's happening on the ground in Yemen right now? And if not, what do you think are the inaccuracies in it?
And thank you, Ms. Lesko, for that question. I do not think it accurately depicts what's happening in this region of the world, primarily because it says nothing about Iran. Iran is the largest state sponsor of terror. You just saw the Khomeini come out today saying they defeated the resistance, victory. Iran is in Iraq and in Syria. They are filling the void and the vacuum. We can talk about the withdrawal of troops out of Syria. It's a whole other issue. But guess who's going to fill that vacuum? It's going to be Iran. And they're on the move. They're supportive of President Maduro in Venezuela. And they are in Yemen. Unlike our U.S. forces who are not there, which this resolution calls to withdraw, Iran is in Yemen actively arming and fighting with the Houthi rebels against the government of Yemen, causing a civil war, humanitarian crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen. And they're also firing rockets into Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia, you can debate that, whether they have an obligation, I would say they do, to defend themselves if they're getting rockets fired into their country. We know that Hezbollah is in Lebanon, Hamas is in Gaza. There are so many rockets being manufactured in Lebanon today, and the chairman knows this, that they can overcome the Iron Dome defense system that the Israeli government has. This policy worries me because it almost appears to be pro-Iranian and in the end, anti-Israel, because that's who it's going to hurt and help. It's going to hurt Israel, and it's going to help Iran. And beyond just the definitions of what, active hostilities in the region are, which we don't have the troops there, there are broader foreign policy implications to this.
Thank you, Representative McCall. I have a couple questions for Chairman Engel. Chairman Engel, I think you stated this earlier, that previous administrations have defined hostilities as engaging in live fire or, troops on the ground type of thing. And I believe you stated, correct me if I'm wrong, that it is true, there are no troops on the ground. And so I guess I'm trying to understand the purpose of this resolution, because if there's not hostilities on the ground as defined by all previous administrations. And if aerial refueling for the Saudi coalition ended on November 9th of 2018, which I've been told it has, and the White House also indicates that the Joint Planning Committee has ended as well. I'm not understanding the necessity for this resolution, because to me it doesn't, there's no hostilities on the ground, and we've stopped the air refueling, and so if you could help me understand.
Well, let me first of all say what this does. The resolution that we're considering today is limited to counter Houthi activities. It does not affect U.S. military activities or cooperation with other countries on efforts to counter al-Qaeda, ISIS, or other terrorist groups, so it doesn't have anything to do with that. My friend, the ranking member, knows that I am as harsh on Iran and its mischief as anyone in this Congress. The longer this conflict goes on, the better off Iran is, because we're working to interdict Iranian contributions to the Houthis, and Iran is obviously taking advantage of this conflict. The bottom line, again, for me, is that this is a perfect time for Congress to look at the bigger picture and for Congress to reassert its authority to go to war or to conduct hostilities. And we've seen time after time after time, I've been here for 30 years, administration after administration after administration, doesn't matter what party, where Congress is just along for the ride, and we are told that this is the way it is. This is the first step of Congress reasserting itself. Can we pluck out or pick out certain things that we don't like or certain reasons not to do it? You can always find reasons not to do something. But I think it's about time that we asserted our authority, and this is the fight that's going on right now, and this seems to me to be a very good time to do it, especially since the Senate, a number of Republican senators supported this in the Senate. So hopefully this would be bipartisan, and you know, if you don't like the way we're doing it here, then come up with something else to show that we're not going to just be a rubber stamp of no matter who sits in the White House. So is this a perfect thing? No, but it's certainly something that is good to basically say we're, to quote an old movie, we're fed up and we're not going to take it anymore.
Thank you, Chairman Engel. And Madam Chair, if I could just make a brief statement. I mean, I guess I could understand this if there was hostilities going on in the ground and the Congress didn't give authority to do it. But it seems like even in committee, I think Mr. Connolly, his quote said, "I appreciate the I don't even know this word, I had to look it up, by the way, juridical distinction made by the ranking member that the United States is not technically involved on the ground in hostilities." And then I think I heard you said, it's true, we're not on the ground in hostilities. And then that combined with, we've already stopped the refueling, I guess I just don't understand the need for this resolution.
Well,
I would understand it if we were there, you know, and there was hostilities and Congress hadn't given authority, but it doesn't appear to live up to that standard to me.
Well, let me flip it. If it doesn't, if this is not a picture perfect fight where there are hostilities, then you have nothing to lose by supporting this, because it's really just asserting our prerogatives in terms of doing what we should be doing, in terms of declaring war, or it's this thing the War Powers Act was put into it. So if it doesn't affect it, it's no harm. But I think every one of us should be able to agree that it's time that the Congress usurp its rightful strength and power over the chief executive. Or else we're going to there will be other people sitting here 30 years from now lamenting the fact about how we've been involved in hostilities and Congress has never had the opportunity to vote one way or another. And I think this is a good example of the administration, or any administration, moving ahead and once again disregarding Congress, and I think it's time to stop it.
And thank you, Chairman Engel. I mean, I respectfully, you've been doing this longer than me, but I respectfully disagree that it doesn't do any harm, because as we heard from Ranking Member McCall, there's a lot of different security contracts we have with even our NATO allies, and if we go down this path, I don't see how we can work with anyone. But thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Perlmutter?
Just a couple questions. Mr. McCall, you talked about boots on the ground. Do you think that the War Powers Act and the AUMFs that we did in 2001, 2002 require boots on the ground? Because you guys are focusing on the word hostilities, and I want to focus on the word use of armed forces, commit military action. So my questions really relate to drones, relate to bombing runs, relate to things where we may not have boots on the ground, but we certainly are directing military action.
So it says United Armed Forces engaged in hostilities. That's a historic definition, and I would argue that we just don't have that in Yemen. And that's the simple argument. If you want to say hey, if you intend to put troops on the ground in Yemen, you need to get an authorized use of military force, Congress, I'd be more sanguine with that than I am saying that you have to withdraw forces that you don't even have there. The assistance is with the...
But my question was drones, bombing runs, things where we don't have anybody on the ground.
So
But
we are providing assistance in Saudi.
Yeah.
In a classified context. I don't know if I can go, how far I can go into this, but it's not what you're saying. It's intelligence-based. It's targeting to minimize collateral damage when they do bomb the Houthis. And so we don't have drones or missiles that we're firing from Saudi into Yemen. This is not the case. If it were, I would say you're correct.
So, I mean, because you've driven, Ms. Lesko and you are talking sort of this bright line, you got to have boots on the ground, but it's really more of it could be broader than that if we're using drones. Look, you guys talk about this in foreign affairs all the time, or on the Intelligence Committee, or in HASC. You know, we're up here in the Rules Committee, and I'm dealing with financial services things and, getting our astronauts to Mars on the Science Committee. So, I mean, really, I want to know, is this a bright line kind of thing or not, the committing to military action, in your estimation, and Mr. Engel, yours too?
Yeah, I mean, it's engagement in hostilities, having the United States Armed Forces present. And the definition goes into live fire engagement, which would be planes, missiles. And as I mentioned, we're not firing missiles at the Houthis.
But we may be offering some kind of intelligence to assist in whatever the targeting is.
Can I answer that?
I said we may. It didn't say we are.
We are providing security assistance like we do with Israel and NATO and 117 different countries. And again, Ellie and I are best friends. I wish we weren't having to debate this one, but we are. And I don't think you want to use the War Powers Act to start uprooting those 117 other countries that we have security agreements with, that we don't have our troops there, but we are providing intelligence assistance to them, because that does puts us in a more empowered position throughout the globe, and I think it makes the planet safer.
If I could just add, what we're doing today is essentially, the way I look at it, we're cleaning up the administration's previous disingenuous interactions with Congress from last year. The Secretary of State in this war certified that everything was going smoothly in Yemen. And even when 500 people were killed in 1 month, the administration said that things were going well in Yemen. The coalition was protecting civilians. We know they were not protecting civilians. And the War Powers Resolution was absolutely intended to force the hand of an administration that is willing to submit false certifications to Congress. And that's why we need to assert our prerogatives. It goes back to the same old thing. We are working to interdict Iranian contributors to the Houthis. Iran, as I said before, is taking advantage of this conflict, but the longer this conflict goes on, the better off Iran is. It boils down, and I said it before, nothing is picture perfect. But the fact of the matter is, everything's not going smoothly in Yemen. And if we wanted to just walk away again and not get involved and use our prerogative, then we can maybe change the Constitution and say that the Congress doesn't have the power to declare war because the chief executive will just send us wherever he likes, and we'll just go along with it. And that's happened for too long now. This is an attempt to yank that back.
And we have authorities on the committee to, through oversight and other measures, to restrict these transactions as we see fit. My only argument is that we're probably 90% in agreement on all of this. It's just that using the War Powers Act to do this is an inappropriate tool as it's defined.
So, and that may be. We know that the Senate undertook passing a resolution last Congress. We refused either through the Rules Committee or somewhere along the line to take it up. So we didn't take it up. Two things, obviously, the slaughter and the starvation and the water and all the things that are going on in Yemen that just, are atrocious, coupled with Khashoggi and his murder, bring all of this to the fore. And there's been an unwillingness by the White House to really, push back on Saudi Arabia, or, we continue to support and undertake support of their efforts in Yemen, and we got to do something of serious and substantial nature. And I think that's the reaction you have here. Now, if you guys come up with something that we can get to the White House and it pushes back, beyond saying, hey, we're not going to authorize this kind of stuff anymore, then more power to you. But the cavalier attitude with the murder, we didn't have anything to do with it, and then, everybody backs up, and to the point we all find out the guy was dismembered in the embassy. It's hard to feel any affection or some obligation to a regime that does that kind of stuff. So with that, I'd yield back.
And can I respond? Just yesterday, the chairman and I sent a very strongly worded statement to the administration because the report that we requested on Khashoggi was like shorter than this. And it didn't have any of the reporting we asked for. And so we stood together in a very bipartisan effort you have to brief Congress on what happened. So we intend to fully investigate and get to the bottom of Khashoggi. I would argue, though, it has really nothing to do with Yemen and our lack of forces in Yemen.
Okay, thank you for your testimony.
Thanks.
Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd ask permission to insert the statement of administration policy into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. I'm going to take the liberty of reading part of this because I think it adds context to what I think is a very important and frankly very useful discussion that we're having in this committee. Mr. Chairman, it reads as follows. The administration strongly opposes passage of H.J.Res 37, a joint resolution that purports to direct the President to remove United States forces from hostility in or affecting the Republic of Yemen with certain exceptions. The premise of the joint resolution is flawed. Since 2015, the United States has provided limited support to member countries of the Saudi-led coalition, including intelligence sharing, logistics support, and until recently, aerial refueling to assist in the defense of United States allies and partners. The provision of this support has not caused the United States forces to be introduced into hostilities. Such support is provided pursuant to licenses and approvals under the Arms Export Control Act, statutory authorities of the Department of Defense to provide logistic support to foreign countries, and the President's constitutional powers. Because the President has directed United States forces to support Saudi-led coalition under his constitutional powers, the joint resolution would raise serious constitutional concerns to the extent it seeks to override the President's determination as Commander-in-Chief. In addition to its erroneous premise, the joint resolution would harm bilateral relationships in the region, negatively affect our ability to prevent the spread of violent extremist organizations such as al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS in Yemen, and establish bad precedent for future legislation by defining hostilities to include defense cooperation, such as aerial refueling for purposes of this legislation. While we appreciate that Sections 4 and 5 of the resolution acknowledge these serious consequences to some extent, after-the-fact reporting is not an effective means to mitigate them. Our continued cooperation with regional partner nations allows the United States to support diplomatic negotiations to end the conflict, promote humanitarian access, mitigate civilian casualties, enhance efforts to recover United States hostages in Yemen, and defeat terrorists who seek to harm the United States. If H.J.Res 37 were presented to the President, his senior advisors would recommend he veto the joint resolution. A couple of points to make. And to be very fair, and I appreciate you, Mr. Chairman, in the way that you framed this debate, because you made this point. This began under the last administration, not this one. And if anything, this administration has actually pulled back from the commitment that the Obama administration made and carried on for 2 years in Yemen. You know, it's pretty complex here in terms of the situation. Second point, you know, I asked my staff, just out of curiosity, how many Republican senators voted for this? 7, one of whom's no longer there. I suspect on the floor, I don't know how people are going to vote. It's not a matter we would whip something like this, but we'll have an overwhelming majority opposed to this resolution. So I suspect the President will very easily sustain his veto. And what concerns me the most is that we will take an issue where there actually is a chance for bipartisan agreement and make it partisan over something that doesn't matter much. You want to write a new AUMF? Count me in. You want to go back and revisit 2001, 2002 resolutions that passed before most of us were in Congress? Pass me in. But limiting the legitimate powers of the commander-in-chief to you know, not engage in hostilities, but to fulfill security agreements, which have not, by the way, in many cases, come before this body. Does anybody know, I'll direct this question to the Chairman, then to my friend, the ranking member, how many security agreements we have around the world?
117 countries.
I know the Chairman was just being polite to let you go first. But that's true. And those are, you know, that's different than alliances. A security agreement is not an alliance that's been ratified by the President of or by the Congress of the United States. In other words, we grant the executive branch broad authority to engage in these kinds of things, and they're pretty valuable to us. They've been valuable to our friends. So it does concern me that, number one, we're going to take what should be an institutional question and turn it largely into a partisan fight. And it's an institutional question where you have a lot of friends on our sides of the aisle, but they're not going to go this far. They're not going to say any president, including the last president, who, after all, engaged in this for 2 years, you know, and would have had exactly the same statement that, I mean, if this were, we roll back the clock 2 years, this would be from the Obama administration.
But if I might, Mr.
Yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, please.
No, thank you. The problem I have, not that some of the things you're stating are totally wrong. I mean, they're you know, sincere. I don't agree with them, but sincere. But by that logic of what you were reading, Congress should never get involved. I mean, just allow any administration to continue to ignore Congress's prerogatives. There's always, as I said before, we're never going to get a picture-perfect case. There's always going to be a reason why this should not fall into the realm of what we're discussing. The fact of the matter is, you mentioned an AUMF. I'd love to have an AUMF. Try to find an AUMF which can get a majority of votes. I dare you to, because it's a near impossible thing to do. So I think that we have obligations to do it. And this is a perfect example of where Congress is along for the ride, and once again, we're not objecting or trying to change anything. We're just giving the president the authorization that he wants, any president wants, and I think that's not something we should continue to do.
Well, Mr. Chairman, can I ask you this, because I think my friend, the ranking member, made a very good point. Why did you choose not to mention anything about Iranian involvement, where they have people on the ground there supporting the Houthi rebels? And how did this conflict begin in the first place? Didn't the rebels overthrow a legitimate government?
Well, I'm not going to, be supportive of the rebels, and certainly not supportive of Iran. I don't think that that's the point. I think there are things that we've done. We've sanctioned Iran. We'll sanction them again if need be. I just don't think that we can just pull something out of a hat and say, well, this is a reason why we shouldn't get involved. You'll always figure out a reason. And again, this doesn't include all kinds of security cooperation or even refueling. It covers refueling of war planes as they make bombing runs in a war. That's all it includes. It's very limited.
Let me ask you this, and I'll ask it to both of you. How do you think the Iranians would regard this resolution if it were passed?
How do I think they would?
Yeah, I'm just interested in your opinion.
I really don't care what they think.
You don't think they would see this as somehow the United States is pulling out, we're not, somehow helpful to them? I mean,
Well, first of all, I think it would recognize something that does not exist, and that is that U.S. forces are actively engaged on the ground in Yemen. But in a twisted way, by doing this resolution, we are sort of suggesting that that is happening, and the president, by order of Congress, has to pull them out. How will the Houthis view that, and the Iranians? Weakness.
let me ask you
It
this. I
doesn't
mean,
matter how they would view it, in my opinion, because when Iran or any other country does something that's not in our national interest, we will respond accordingly. So I don't think one thing has anything to do with another. It's not going to be where Iran says, oh, good, now the United States is not going to get involved in anything. If there are malign intentions and malign actions, we'll get involved.
If I could say, I think it's a green light for the Iranians to go down and arm the Houthis even more and cause more mischief down there and more bloodshed and more humanitarian crises and more refugees. I think it makes things worse, not better.
Yeah, well, that, Mr. Ranking Member, is my opinion. And again, if we were, I mean, something like this would actually be, I think, much more apropos if we were talking about Syria, where we actually did commit troops into another country. We've shot down Syrian aircraft over in Syrian airspace. I mean, there's a place to have a good discussion as to whether or not we did the right thing or whether or not Congress should have okayed it. And
Now the president wants to remove troops, all our troops.
well, I was actually
which
going to make.
I am absolutely opposed to.
I was going to make that case. We're attacking for removing troops, and then we're attacking him for a place where he doesn't have any troops and hasn't presented any. I mean, that doesn't seem to me at all consistent. Helping an ally against an enemy, and the Iranians, in my view, are our enemies, and maintaining leverage in the region, and perhaps being able to use our good offices to broker a compromise or humanitarian changes. I just think we send the wrong message to our friends and the wrong message to our enemies. And I think we divide ourselves at home in an area that, in terms of constitutional progress, I tend to be with my friend, Mr. McGovern here. I actually argued with our speaker, former speaker, not the current speaker, last year, or 2 years ago. Look, if we can't come up with an AUMF, put the president's suggested AUMF on the floor. And if it passes, fine. That's the will of Congress. You know, because his argument was, well, I'm not sure we could pass, you know, well, tough. I mean, this is congressional power. We have thousands of people committed. We don't have people committed here. And we are getting perilously close. Again, I could, as an old historian, I could go everywhere from Roosevelt using destroyers to protect American ships out to Iceland, and it wasn't congressionally authorized. We weren't at war with Germany, but it was within the realm of the authority of the president, or so deemed, and it was certainly the right thing to do. I just don't think you limit the ability of the executive to this. When you talk about putting troops in harm's way, that to me is the red line. This other idea, we're going to second guess you 4 years after the fact, by the way, and in a different administration. And I'm not suggesting that some of my friends wouldn't have done that in the last administration. We were in the majority, so I don't mean it that way. But I'm saying, yeah, we're getting awful late to the game, and I would suggest we're in the wrong game. We want to do this. Let's go back and look at 201, 202, or Syria, or someplace where the War Powers Act, to me, really does apply. I would have loved to have done it in Libya, where somehow the Obama administration stretched the NATO alliance to cover air action in a country that hadn't attacked us, wasn't engaged in terrorism, didn't attack anybody in NATO, and yet you got French airplanes, British airplanes, and American airplanes bringing down a government that's now a state with a hotbed of terrorism, and things probably worse off. So, again, I know I've gone on longer. I should, Chairman. You've been very generous. Let me just, I'm not going to go through all these questions, but I do want you both to speculate. I mean, do you think these other countries that we have agreements with will draw any conclusions from this as to whether or not the executive branch can enter into agreements that are short of war, but pretty important in terms of intelligence cooperation? And do you think that maybe this would have some repercussions? The Saudis have been enormously helpful to us in terms of intelligence about Al-Qaeda, ISIS, some of these other areas. Do you have any concerns that that might be jeopardized by this kind of action?
I don't, because I think the Saudis still need us for lots of things. We're not, by this in any way, shape, or form, totally pulling away from the Saudis. And you mentioned Iran. I think Iran actually benefits from this conflict. The longer it goes on, the longer there's more instability in the area. Iran likes that. So the best way to hurt Iran is to end this conflict and stand up to them on other things. They do a lot of things that I can find difficulty with. I don't think what we do here has an effect in any other situation.
So if I could answer that question, I'm looking at all the 117 countries. I think it would significantly erode and undermine the confidence of foreign governments to engage in these agreements. Because if Congress can just nullify them under the War Powers Act, even when we don't have U.S. troops on the ground in that country, what kind of signal does that send to our partners? And we're advancing these interests all over the world. I mean, NATO being our biggest one, right? Israel. So I think it would have a detrimental impact on our foreign policy and our ability to lead and enter into these security agreements. As you mentioned, the Saudis, you know, love them or hate them, but the intelligence they provided after 9/11, albeit they were, you know, many complicit with it in Saudi, but the intelligence they provided stopped many terror plots from occurring in this country, many of which I know about from my prior job as chairman of Homeland.
Well, I would just submit this in closing, this because I hate to find myself on different sides of my friend on an issue where I broadly agree with him. I mean, I totally agree. You said the executive was chipped away. I would actually argue the legislative branch is handed over, more because it's wanted to avoid responsibilities for tough votes. And I could point to leaders on both sides that have repeatedly, to try and shield their members from a constitutional responsibility, have let the executive go away, and I could do that over a couple of generations very easily. So we agree with what you're trying to do, but if this thing passes, number one, I'm not sure it'll be picked up in this Senate. This Senate's different than the last Senate, but let's assume it is. If it does, it won't pass by as many votes as it got the last time, in all likelihood, if it passes at all, and it'll get vetoed. And we will walk into a partisan standoff in an area where I think there could have been bipartisan institutional cooperation, where it really was an executive or a legislative branch asserting its Article one authority over the executive branch. In this case, I think it's going to be a lot murkier than that. It's going to look like a partisan fight, and it's going to look like a fight like, well, why are we saying not to have troops in Yemen when we don't have troops in Yemen? Why are we saying not to do, we're not flying over Yemen. There aren't American aircraft involved in this. So I just, again, I think we're walking down a slope that we're missing an opportunity to do something significant, and we're going to make a mistake here, in my view. But with that, again, Mr. Chairman, you've been very generous.
No, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And my colleague from Oklahoma is always very thoughtful on these issues, and we share the view that, and I know you do too, that Congress has ceded so much of its responsibilities to the executive branch. We are forming a new subcommittee here in the Rules Committee on expedited procedures, actually to study some of these issues about how we can reclaim some of our authority and live up to our responsibility. I just want to say one thing. You know, when people ask what's the message we're sending, I hope the message we're sending is that this country, that human rights matters. I mean, what is happening in Yemen is so horrific. And I think for those of us who have been told by the administration officials over and over and over again, well, you know, I had a quiet behind-the-scenes meeting with the Saudi prince or with this person or that person, and I said, oh, it's terrible. I mean, every time in the aftermath of all these meetings, you see, you know, them bombing weddings and hospitals and school buses. This is horrific. And we need to send a message to the Saudi government, no matter whether this gets taken up by the Senate, which I think it will, or whether the president vetoes it or not, you know, that human rights matters to people in this chamber. And I mean, I get it. I mean, the Saudis, provide us valuable information, and we've relied on them for energy, God knows for how long. But the bottom line is, at some point, you know, I mean, there has to be some consequence or some pushback to their horrific behavior, whether it's in Yemen or whether it's how they murdered and dismembered a Washington Post journalist. Or I met with the wife of a Saudi blogger who's been subjected to, Raif Badawi is the blogger, who's been subjected to 50 lashes by the Saudi government, who's been there for 7 years for doing nothing. And he's not unique. So at some point, you know, we have to say, you know, there has to be some pushback. And, you know, what the future of this resolution is, we'll just have to wait and see. But I hope there's a strong bipartisan vote in support of it.
Mr. Chair, if I could,
Sure,
I think we should have a resolution condemning the violence and humanitarian crisis in the region. I think that's something we would all agree on, rather than using the War Powers Act to withdraw troops that do not currently exist, in Yemen.
We look forward to, the Foreign Affairs Committee doing hearings and marking a bill up like they did with this, bringing other legislation to the Rules Committee. I have a bill that I'd like to see come before the House, and that is, a total termination of military assistance to the Saudi government. I mean, I have constituents who can't believe we are selling weapons to a government that would target a Washington Post journalist and have him dismembered and lie about it at the highest levels of that government, or because of how they're acting in Yemen, or because of the way they treat people who, have slightly different opinions about the future of Saudi Arabia than the Crown Prince and all those who surround him. So I hope that this is not the last amendment, last bill that comes before the Rules Committee on Human Rights in Saudi Arabia. I look forward to having more. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for their hard work on this. I'm sorry to hear, Mr. Woodall, that you made the decision to leave us, but we got a lot to learn from you before you go, especially about being a tiger on the floor and leading floor debate. You're really something. So, Mr. Chair, I'm a professor of constitutional law, and for me, this is all decided by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to declare war. And for those of us who believe in constitutional textualism, originalism, and the structural separation of powers, this legislation is a badly needed breath of fresh air. And as Mr. Cole says, for too long, the executive branch, both parties included, has arrogated to itself the power to immerse America in dozens and dozens of military conflicts all over the world. And this usurps the power of Congress to declare war. This was a power that the founders reposed in Article 1 in Section 8 in the enumerated powers of Congress, precisely because they understood that the kings and the princes of the world were constantly plunging the world into military conflict based on personal whimsy or fancy or pique, but most importantly, in every case, without dialogue. And that's what Congress provides. We are the representatives of the people. I get so mad at my beloved Speaker, Speaker Pelosi, when she goes on the floor and says, we are a co-equal branch. We are not a co-equal branch. We are the primary branch of government. We are the representatives of the people. We pass the laws of the people. You look at Article 1, it goes on for pages and pages. And Article 2 says that the president must take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And if there's a war, he's the commander-in-chief. That's it. He is deputized by us to go and do our will. And it's a very tough decision about whether or not to get into war. There are costs, there are benefits, there are risks involved. And it's a lot easier to shirk the duty and say, oh, well, maybe we'll let the president go further down that road, and we've got 117 different places where we're involved with this regime or that regime, and let's maybe just let the president take the burden of it. No, we've got the responsibility. We've got to feel the moral weight of that. And as the chairman of our committee says, and he's been our great leader on this, as a democratic society, our responsibility is to advance human rights however we can. And being a democratic society, which takes care of its people, we try to do that through peace and diplomacy whenever we can. And war is saved for those situations where it's necessary to defend democracy and freedom. So for me, I would be taking this position if the war going on in Yemen were the most just war ever, if it were like our civil war, which I see as a clearly just war, but I know that there's dispute about that, or if it were like World War II, which I see as a clearly just war. But this war is not like our civil war in America, and it's not like World War II. Remotely, the Saudi-led war has cost the lives of more than 10,000 civilians already. Tens of thousands of children have starved because of this war, and the famine now threatens to spread. Millions of people are facing famine and starvation in Yemen. So, I've got to admit, I opposed our complicity with this war before the assassination of the Washington Post journalist Khashoggi, when the Crown Prince ordered his dismemberment, his drawing and quartering, which is effectively torture, and then his murder. I opposed it before that happened, but it showed Congress something, and it showed the world something. If they were willing to do that to a journalist for the Washington Post, if they're willing to provoke the wrath of one of the world's great newspapers, imagine what that kind of arrogance and sense of impunity would allow them to do to the wretchedly poor civilians of Yemen. This is a situation where Save the Children tells us 84,700 Yemeni children have likely died of starvation between 2015 and 2018. More than 84,000 children. So we cannot allow our country to be complicit anymore in the deaths of civilians at the hands of a regime that assassinates journalists and political opponents, that imprisons feminist activists, that spreads anti-Semitic propaganda through its Wahhabist ideology in madrasas it pays for all over the world, that jails people for blasphemy, that jails people for apostasy, that jails people for witchcraft and heresy, and that produced the vast majority of the 9/11 hijackers. And we still don't have a full accounting of what took place in the 9/11 attack. So, to sum up my strong feelings about this, our founders were of the belief that constitutional republics, democracies, would not go to war against each other. And I think that history has borne them out. It's basically the fanatical, authoritarian, and totalitarian regimes that have continued to plunge the world into war, and democracies have not gone to war against each other. Now, I don't know of the 117 military relationships we have, which ones justify us going to war. I don't know if we need to go to war against Saudi Arabia or against Iran. I don't know, but I do know this. The correct process for us to make that decision is for Congress to debate the complexities of the situation, and for Congress, the representatives of all the people, to decide. It should never be trusted to one person under our constitutional regime. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Obviously, we grant broad authority to the president, but it is not unlimited, and I feel very strongly that in this area, we do need to pull back. I look forward to this as a way to start that process. Obviously, it's just a start, given the limited hostilities or lack of hostilities on the ground in this case. There's been some concern expressed about the message we might be sending to various foreign actors. I'm more concerned, frankly, with the message we're sending to this administration, that that power is not unlimited and will be reclaimed by this Congress. So thank you.
Mr. Morelli.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the chair and ranking members of the Foreign Relations Committee. I, first of all, appreciate the passion and the eloquence of all of our members. I do also want to congratulate Mr. Woodall on his, I know he has 23 months here, remaining with us, but I also know today is his birthday, so there's a hell of a way to spend your time. So happy birthday, Mr. Woodall. Mr. Chairman, I appreciated and very much grateful for Mr. Raskin's conversations around the powers of the War Powers Act and the long history of Article 1 and the power to declare war for the United States. I read that, not only do I concur, but as I read the War Powers Resolution in U.S. Code 1547C, it doesn't, there are other circumstances that exist which put us in the state where this resolution would be appropriate. It says the introduction of the United States Armed Forces to include the assignment of members of such armed forces to command, coordinate, participate in the movement of, or accompany the regular or irregular military forces of any foreign country or government with such military forces are engaged. As I understand it, both from public statements made by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others, that we do have a small number of members of the military forces, that they're assisting in targeting aerial targets, that they're engaged in and coordinating with refueling and the movement, as it says, the movement of military forces of a foreign government or a foreign country. I think this very much falls within the context of what the Congress back in 1973 meant by enacting the War Powers Act. In fact, up until that time, you could argue that unless the Congress affirmatively declared war, that the interpretation would be that the president could do anything with the military because as commander-in-chief, without the direct consent of the Congress, affirmation, an affirmative act of declaring war, that the president could do whatever he or she wanted. But that's why the War Powers Act was enacted, to prevent that from happening. And I think we are in a state where the Congress clearly is within its rights to utilize the powers granted to us under the War Powers Act to act here. I also think you can't have it both ways. Either we're not doing enough to trigger the War Powers Act, in which case the conversations around Iran and national security wouldn't be appropriate, or we are. So I would argue that we are sufficiently engaged, and I also would suggest this, that if the president and the executive branch feels that this is such an appropriate national security imperative, they ought to come to the Congress, they ought to present the case, they ought to make the case to us and to the American public as to why we should be investing in this engagement. Human rights issues have been well covered by my friends, and I don't need to repeat them, but I do, and certainly I'm no expert. In my reading of the material and my understanding of the origins of the War Powers Act and the primacy of Congress to engage here, I think this is entirely within our purview, and I think this resolution ought to be advanced by this committee and by the House. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have little to add to what my colleagues have already said. I would say that the President's argument that our continued cooperation with regional partners, among other things, allows us to promote humanitarian access and mitigate civilian casualties in the case of Yemen simply hasn't occurred. We have a case, the impact of famine and disease on young children is particularly heartbreaking. And therefore, I believe very strongly that we ought to support this resolution.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the great testimony. I mean, I think this has been, to me, a very informative hearing. I appreciate both of you for being here. I realize we have some disagreement, but I think that everybody stated their case, and I want to thank both of you, and I want to thank Mr. Khanna in particular for bringing this resolution forward, and look forward to it going to the House floor. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. And may I say, I think we all agree on Article 1 responsibilities. I look forward to coming back with the chairman on a war powers, resolution that we can agree on.
Well, both Mr. Cole and I know Democrats and Republicans on this committee for a long time now have been talking about the importance of doing that, and I hope we can get to that. So I thank you both for being here, and I think there are no other. Does any other member wish to ask a question? No, everybody's asked their questions. Anyone else wish to testify? Being none, then I will now turn this over to my distinguished. This closes the hearing portion of the proceeding here today. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Mr. Chairman, I regret not being here to hear my colleague, Mr. Woodall's ruminations, and also would add my happy birthday to him. I sent him a signal that he and I need to talk. So I mean that, Rob, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do that soon. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I move the committee grant H.J.Res 37, directing the removal of United States Armed Forces from hostilities in the Republic of Yemen that have not been authorized by Congress, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the joint resolution. The rule makes in order as original text for purpose of amendment, the amendment in the nature of a substitute, consisting of the text of rules, committee print 116-4, and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule provides all points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report and may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule waives the requirement of Clause 6A of Rule 13 for a 2/3 vote to consider a report from the Committee on Rules on the same day it is presented to the House with respect to any resolution reported through the legislative day of February 17, 2019, relating to a measure making or continuing appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2019. The rule also provides that it shall be in order at any time through the calendar day of February 17, 2019, for the Speaker to entertain motions that the House suspend the rules as though under Clause 1 of Rule 15, and that the Speaker or her designee shall consult with the minority leader or his designee on the designation of any matter for consideration pursuant to this section. Finally, the rule provides that the chair of the Committee on Appropriations may insert in the congressional record not later than February 17, 2019, such materials as she may deem explanatory of measures making or continuing appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2019.
Well, thank you very much. And as we've just heard from the gentleman from Florida, this rule provides for consideration of H.J.Res 37, which directs the removal of United States Armed Forces from hostilities in the Republic of Yemen that have not been authorized by Congress under a structured rule. The rule makes in order two amendments, a bipartisan amendment and a Republican amendment, each debatable for 10 minutes. I think they're the only two that were germane. The rule provides same-day authority for measures related to fiscal year 2019 appropriations, suspension authority, and the authority of the chair of the Committee on Appropriations to insert explanatory language into the congressional record all through Sunday, February 17th. And I just want to make a little editorial comment, because I can. You know, and I just want to point out, so we're making two amendments in order, including the Buck Amendment. And I say that because we're trying to take seriously our commitment to a more accommodating process. It doesn't mean we're going to be perfect, and it doesn't mean there won't be amendments that we block in the future. But this, for me, personally, was a tough one because I oppose the Buck Amendment. I think if we want to disengage from the conflict in Yemen, we need to disengage from intelligence sharing. But I think this House ought to debate that issue. And it's a tough issue for some of us, but we ought to have that debate. The last Congress, when the Republicans were in the majority, they blocked numerous attempts to debate our role in the Yemen conflict. They even deprivileged war powers resolutions related to Yemen twice, all, I think, aimed at shutting down debate on this issue. So I think, and I'm not blaming anybody up here for that, I'm just saying that's just a fact. We're trying to have a more accommodating process and to ensure that the ideas of members are heard, even ideas that we may disagree with. And so I say that because I think my Republican friends may want to consider this fairer process as they draft some of their motions to recommit. Instead of always putting forward kind of gotcha votes, perhaps we could have an honest and open debate about our policy differences. But in any event, that's my totality of my editorial comment. So you've heard the motion from the gentleman from Florida. Is there any amendment or discussion? Hearing none, then the vote will be on the motion from the gentleman of Florida. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Mr. Chairman, can we have a roll call? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Aye. Mr. Hastings votes aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Raskin. Aye. Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Morelli. Aye. Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole votes no. Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko votes no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to. And I will be handling it for the majority. And without objection, unless anyone else has anything else to add, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.